Thank you all for joining today. My name is Max Gennis. I'm co-founder and CEO of PolicyEngine, and I'm here with my colleague David Trimmer, Policy Fellow at PolicyEngine. And we are here to go through a new analysis that David has conducted around the new flat tax cut to Kentucky's income tax. So we'll start by just describing what PolicyEngine is. We're a nonprofit that builds software to simulate the effect of public policies like these and some of the techniques that we adopt. And then I'll turn it over to David to go through how this affects first of household in Kentucky and also the impacts on Kentucky overall of this new change based on our simulations. Finally, we'll sort of wrap up with a few of our plans to make PolicyEngine even more relevant to Kentucky's tax debates in the future. All right, so what is PolicyEngine? We're a nonprofit that is focused on computing the impact of public policy for everyone. And what that means is really all of our software is free and open source. So anyone can do everything we're about to show you. You can see what the impact of current policies are on your household. You can also design a policy reform or select one like we've done today and see how that affects your household or society overall. Our system powers a wide range of use cases, so we're going to show a couple of them through our own interface today. How PolicyEngine affects your own taxes and benefits. We also surface all that information through an API, so you might see other products like My Friend Ben or Benefit Navigator that help people understand their benefits through systems that rely on our rules engine. And then much of what today we'll cover is our reform simulations. So you can design the policy reform and run it through a big, what's called a microsimulation model that we have. And what is that? Well, microsimulation is a really powerful technique used by organizations like the Congressional Budget Office, think tanks, and academic institutions. So I'll just go through a quick example of how this looks. The idea is there's really two elements that are core. One is we encode the tax and benefit rules. So we can say for a household with a certain amount of income, certain number of kids, how are your taxes and benefits summing up? So in this case, this household faces a 30% average tax rate, 30,000 in taxes on 100,000 in gross income. Now you want to make that flexible so that you can simulate not just current law, but also counterfactual policies. So suppose there's some new tax reform that cuts their taxes by $5,000. We're able to simulate that for that individual. But the power comes in where we apply it to step two, which is bring in representative data on individual households. So in this case, we just have 3 households, and there's kind of diverse effects of the policy on the households. So this first one had a tax cut. Second one, because they have some kids, they're sort of affected in a different way. Maybe they have higher taxes. They also have benefits. And the third household has no change at all. The last piece is we assign a weight to every household. So every household is going to represent a certain number of real world households. And if you want to see what the impact is of this policy reform on society, we're going to basically take a weighted aggregation of each of these quantities. So that's lets us say, okay, the total cost of this program is $1.1 billion. So that's that net income change in the yellow multiplied by the weight on the far right. So that's sort of the methodology that we use. We'll sort of go through step one of that, where we encode all the policy rules and also apply it to this tax reform at hand. And to go through that, I will turn it over to my colleague, David. Take it away.
Thanks, Max. So first thing we want to do is we want to go to our site and we're going to demo our household calculator. So if you go to our home page, you can see these 2 big buttons here, compute my taxes and benefits, as well as compute policy reform and impacts. So let's start with the first, and we're going to go over a standard household example and just look at their taxes and benefits through current law. So all we need to do here is just enter some household details. So we ask 6 questions to start, and we look at tax year, marital status, number of children, state, employment income, and age. So for this example, we're going to look at 2026 because that's going to be the first year we look at our reform that we're going to build for Kentucky later on. We're going to look at a married couple with 2 children, and we want to make sure that they are in Kentucky. And we want to assign them $50,000 of employment income, and their ages are good right there. So once we hit submit, we get to see the results, and we can see that for this example, their net income is going to be $51,647. This is due to them having their employment income of $50,000, but also they receive some benefits, some refundable credits, as well as they have to pay some federal and state tax. And we can expand to see what type of benefits they're receiving. We can see that they're getting a SNAP allotment of $852. They're also receiving free school meals. For refundable tax credits, we can see that they're getting the earned income tax credit as well as the child tax credit. And one of our features is we can explain with AI why they're receiving this type of benefit. So we just click explain on AI. We feed this into a large language model, and then it tells us exactly why they are receiving this type of benefit, key factors, important thresholds and rules that we can look at and see why this household is receiving this benefit and what would change if certain aspects of this household were different. So that's currently what we have for a current law, examining a household on current law, but we also want to see what this household, how this household will be affected under the new reform. So we want to take a look at the microsimulation impacts. So we're going to go back to our home page, and instead of computing my tax and benefits, we're going to compute a policy reform. So in this option, this is where we house our microsimulation model, all of our parameters that can be changed, housed under different tabs. We have the IRS that deals with federal tax policy, Social Security benefits, SSI. But what we want to look at is states. So we want to click on states and go down to Kentucky, tax, income, and Kentucky's income tax rate. So currently in our model for the year 2024, we have the rate is 4%, which is correct, but we can see here that the rate is changing over time, and we have accurately reflected that in our model. So for 2026, due to the recent law that's been passed, the tax rate will drop to 3.5%. So this is already included in our model. So if we ran impacts, we wouldn't get anything just by looking at the 3.5%. So what we're going to need to do is actually set this rate back to 4%. Just bear with me for a sec. So we set this back to 4. And what we're going to do is hit more options. And instead of comparing this law to current law baseline, what we're going to do is flip it. So if we hit this arrow right here, we flip what we're comparing that reform we just built. So we're going to compare current law with that 3.5% rate to a baseline policy where the tax rate was at 4%. So this is the way that we can see what a cut in tax rate is, how that's going to affect the population. So we can get some microsimulation impacts. However, let's see how this affects that household that we just went through. So we go back to our household calculator, and we're going to put in the exact same details, 2026, married couple, 2 kids. We're going to look at Kentucky. Again, $50,000 of income, and the ages are good the way they are. And we are going to get results. Now, instead of seeing the total net income that they have, we're going to see their change in net income. So under this reform, their net income is increasing by $233 overall. And we can see that this is for their total tax. We can see that their tax liability, we can see that their state tax liability is dropping by $233. We can also look at varying your earnings, and we can examine how this is, how as this household's income changes, so does their change in net income. And actually, this might take a minute or two. I think I have a tab up already. Yes. So we can see through varying your earnings, and let's go back to net income actually. We can see how this household's net income changes as their income changes. So this dot right here represents the 50,000. Their net income goes up by 230. If they were to make, let's say 75,000, their change in net income would be $358 per year. And it just keeps going up since if you have a higher tax load liability, a tax cut's going to affect you more. So we have we understand how this is affecting that household, but let's see how this reform is affecting the state overall. So we make sure that we are in the right place. We're in Kentucky. We're looking at the right year, 2026, because that's when this tax cut's going to come into place. And we calculate the economic impact, and we can get some microsimulation results. So we can see that this reform overall is going to cost $635.9 million, reduce poverty by 1.3%. We use the supplemental poverty measure, just so you know. And it raises net income for 73% of the people in Kentucky. But we can get some more specific impacts. So we can look at the budgetary impact. And we can see that while this is a state reform, it's also having some impact on federal tax revenues. It's actually increasing federal tax revenues, which makes sense because people in Kentucky have lower tax liabilities. They're claiming less on the state and local tax deduction, which increases federal tax revenues. But state and local tax is decreasing, obviously, because the tax cut is lowering revenues at the state level. But we can also see some distributional impacts. We can see from a relative basis as a percent of net income for each of these households. So we can see that this is mostly rising as you move up the income deciles. But we can also see an average benefit. We can see that the average household is going to receive $335 in 2026, and this is going to change based off the income decile you're in. If you're in the first income decile, that's typically where the lowest income households are. Average benefit's $5. If you're at the top, average benefit $1,470. We also have what we call our winners and losers charts. This is basically just to show the percentage of each resident in each decile, what percent of them are net beneficiaries. For this proposal, nobody is worse off, but if anybody's worse off, we would see them displayed in gray or darker gray on the right side of this chart. But for this tax cut, everybody is either a net beneficiary or is unaffected in this proposal, or in this law, I should say. We can also look at poverty impacts. We can view this by age. Again, we use the supplemental poverty measure, so we're seeing some reduction in child poverty and working age poverty, no effect on senior poverty, and then overall we're seeing 1.3% reduction in poverty overall. We can also look at deep poverty, break it down by race and gender as well. We also have our inequality impacts. We can see that the Gini index of income inequality is increasing, as well as the top 10% and 1% share of total net income in the state. We also have our AI summary, which can generate a quick explainer with some of the charts that we just went over on the policy, any reforms that you create in our web app. So we have explain like I'm 5, very simple analysis of this, normal, and then our wonk mode, which is our expert mode. And if we generate, we can see that we start to get some text here that explains the policy and gives us some impact numbers. We can see the revenue dropping at the state and the total tax revenue dropping. We get some of the charts that we went over as well. So this can help people who are unaware of the policy, how this affects the state overall. And any of our policies created in the web app, you can reproduce these in a Python notebook. with all of that, I will pass it back to Max.
Thanks, David. So as you've seen, there's a lot you can do in the Policy Engine app. You can see how Kentucky tax and benefit policies affect any hypothetical household, how this new policy reform or a custom reform, we could design many other reforms, really infinite numbers, and also how they affect Kentucky overall. But there's a lot more we're excited to bring to inform the Kentucky policy debate in the coming months and years. So a couple of things we're working on right now really involve improving the comprehensiveness, accuracy, and accessibility of the model. So in terms of comprehensiveness, we're actually about to launch new ACA subsidies. So we already have Medicaid rules across all 50 states and DC, and we're about to launch ACA subsidies, at which point you'll be able to see how that affects marginal tax rates, how it affects net income, what kind of the subsidies that different people get, and how that interacts with other programs. We're also working on other programs like childcare subsidies, TANF, housing subsidies, kind of a whole range of other programs we can add. We're also really excited to bring more state level and even congressional district and state legislative district breakdowns to the app. So this is something we are about to launch in the UK version of the product. And we are currently fundraising to make that happen in the US. On the accuracy side, one thing we didn't get into much is the behavioral responses. So you can actually add elasticities, which sort of govern how different people respond to different tax reforms in terms of how much they work and how much they earn. This is based on reviews from the Congressional Budget Office, but you can also customize it. There's a lot more we could add in terms of not just behavioral responses, but second order responses. So how much does it affect the macroeconomy? How much does child poverty affect child welfare involvement? We're not going to take a stance on those specific effect sizes, but we'll allow users to enter their own parameters to sort of experiment with different reforms and see what the downstream effects would be. And finally, we're working with the design agency to improve the accessibility of the model in a number of ways. So we've completed a UX research study. We're really going to just refresh the whole thing to be a more modern web app kind of standard and integrate AI in even more places to have targeted summaries of what your policy is, what the impacts are, what specific levers do, and answer questions more directly, as well as bring in more interfaces for researchers to integrate it into their own workflow. So overall, we're excited to make more of an AI-oriented policy advisor that's accessible to anyone, starting with our current microsimulation capacity, and welcome any questions or feedback about our research here today on Kentucky's income tax cut. All right, I think we can just close there.
Okay.
Pretend there were tons of questions waiting for us.
Oh, yeah.
Great. That was awesome.
Good.
Anything else? Let's see. While we're on, I guess we can stop recording.
Oh, was I the one recording? Yeah.
Yeah.